I'm joined now by Sheila Weldon with Hobbee Acres. Sheila has been teaching beekeeping to newbies interested in getting started with their own hives and has a wealth of knowledge about beekeeping in general and providing valuable habitat for honeybees and pollinators of all types. Welcome, Sheila.
Thank you, Jeff. This is fun. I'm enjoying this, and it's kind of refreshing a lot of my beekeeping and pollinator information. I'm enjoying this. Warning though, beekeepers sometimes start talking about bees, and we get a little carried away.
I'd like to jump right in. I just highlighted a couple of trees and shrubs that are great for pollinator habitat and an early season food source. I'm curious, what are your two favorite trees for pollinators?
Today, my favorite tree is the Japanese lilac because it's blooming, and my husband cut me a bouquet from that tree and brought it into the house, and my house just smells fantastic. Tomorrow, it probably won't be in bloom, and my favorite tree will be the lindens and the tulip trees. We have young tulip trees. I think we've got three out there, and this year we got some blooms from them. What I like about the tulip tree, it grows very large, very large. And what's sad is they're when they get really big, people cut them down. There was a gorgeous one, I think, over in Pella, and people, because it's so big, it makes them nervous that it's going to fall on their house at some time. So, and we live on acreage, so those were some trees that we wanted to plant. And then and it was kind of sweet to see a tree because I'd heard that it take like 20 years actually before they start producing blooms, but ours, they've probably been in the ground, I don't know, maybe 15 years, I'm thinking. Um, the linden, though, is actually my favorite, and it is, we have, we've planted some, and those are not producing blooms yet. And then the largest tree on our diameter, the trunk and everything, is a linden tree, an American linden tree. Um, there's a lot of reasons I like lindens. The linden tree is fragrant. I love planting plants and trees that have a fragrance. And like when I mentioned the Japanese lilac tree, what I like about it, like it's blooming now, but it smells like springtime when the lilacs are blooming. Um, but the linden trees, their blooms hang down. So if you have a lot of rain, frequent rains, it's not as apt to wash out the nectar. That's one of the problems when we have frequent rains because different plants, different trees, it takes them a while to recover their nectar. Some plants or trees, it's like once the nectar's gone, it's gone. It's not there again. And there's a lot of different varieties of lindens, and they each have their own little reasons why people like them. You know, most people are not planting American lindens on their property because, again, it's a large tree. They don't want it to fall on their house. But there's so many. Pella has a lot of linden trees that they've used for landscaping over there. And a lot of them, a lot of the trees will be fragrant. When I talk about trees for honeybees uh, or other pollinators, the most important thing I think about is that large trees, it's like having acres of blooms in the sky. You know, you plant a little patch of something here on the ground, some of your pollinators are going to it. But for honeybees, um, their colonies are so large, they need a lot of resources. Now, the honeybee is not native to our country. The Europeans brought it over here, the European honeybee. But because of the way our food supply is, and especially with the large monocultures, we need our honeybees. You know, we need to get them to work for us. And but anyway, so that's the advantage of having these really large trees that are just full of blooms and they bloom at different times. And that's why I probably like the linden and the tulip tree because of their size.
Tell me, how is honey made?
Okay. The honey comes from the nectar that the bees are gathering. Now, the bees basically send out Scout. Scout goes out and finds, I always called it their gold mine because, they're looking for that big, normally they're looking for a big tree that's got a lot of blooms that they can get a lot of nectar from. And they go out there, the bee finds, the scout comes back, does the little dance, and next thing you know, that tree is just a buzz with honeybees gathering nectar. We have out here at our house, we have like a cherry tree, ornamental cherry tree, and it's just loaded with blooms in the spring. And I went out there earlier on the deck, and I could just hear all these bees, and there wasn't any wind. And it was just really neat to hear all that activity in that tree. And so they gather that, they take it back to their hive, and usually they are gathering it, especially in the spring. They are gathering all of that nectar so they can mix it with the pollen and then feed the developing larva. And then, so most of the food is immediately going into that. And then I guess you'd say the leftover honey, because they need to collect a lot of honey to get them through the winter and the rest of the summer. So they're collecting throughout the summer. In fact, a honeybee, the last job of their life, their little short-lived life, is a forager, and they basically work themselves to death. Their wings get real ratty, and when they die outside the hive. But they gather all of that, and then they dry it down, and they consume it and feed those resources to the young, and they consume it themselves throughout the winter. If we steal too much honey from them, and that's what we're doing, when we harvest honey, we're stealing the honey from the bees. Um, Sadly, it's almost a standard practice sometimes to remove a lot of honey from the bees, and the beekeepers have to feed the honey, or not feed honey. They have to feed the bees, but they feed them high fructose corn syrup. Now, we really don't like to do that. We never really did do that. And we were always very cautious not to harvest too much from them. But that is a real common practice, and especially in commercial beekeeping, is to take as much honey as you can and then feed the bees back sugar water or high fructose corn syrup. So who knew that people were feeding their bees, right?
You mentioned nectar flow, and I'd like to pick up on that. Could you talk to me about nectar flow?
Different plants produce nectar at different times. Trees, they'll have their nectar flow. They need the nectar because the bees are in the spring, they're very busy collecting pollen. Our maple trees, for example, I wish I had recorded this one earlier this year because we have a maple tree outside our yard, and it was just, you could hear the buzz of the bees in this maple tree. Well, there's no nectar there, but maples produce a lot of pollen. And so the bees, especially in the spring, they're building up their population, and they're getting the pollen, and they're taking the pollen back to their hive. They'll mix it with some of the nectar or the honey in the hive and their own body secretions, and they'll mix that, and that's what they feed their babies, that developing larva that's growing inside the hive. So and the pollen it is one of the most nutrient dense proteins that we or the insects can consume. Um, it's microscopic. We really can't see the pollen, but the bees, they have that hair on fuzzy stuff all over their body. So when they're flying around, they're gathering up that pollen on their body, and then they kind of pack it into little cluster balls on each, like a load. They'll have a load on each side of their body, these nice round balls of pollen, and they bring that back to the hive. And that's what they're doing with the pollen. And then, of course, they're mixing the nectar, and they have to dry that nectar down because nectar is very runny. And as hive progresses in the season, they dry that nectar down to where it needs to be at least less than 19% moisture. If it's higher than that, the honey will ferment and turn into mead. That's how mead is. It's basically nectar or honey that's got too much moisture in it, and that's how people. I have never made mead. I have tasted it, never made it.
Wow, great information. Sheila, I heard a term a while back that I wasn't familiar with, floral fidelity. What is that? Can you educate me on the topic?
Well, people often plant plants or even trees for the honeybees. And then they make a comment, they say, I never see bees on my plants. They never see the honeybees. Well, usually, like I've mentioned, the bees are seeking that gold mine. And so they find that gold mine. All the bees go to the gold mine and they work that gold mine till it's dry. So usually, like, one day, that's what they're doing. They're working that gold mine. And for example, almonds. Now, that's the floral fidelity is why we like our honeybees. It is the only insect that we really manage and that we need um, for our food supply, and especially with all the monocultures. The best monoculture and where the money is on bees is sending our beehives to, no, we never did send ours, but people send their beehives to California. They go over there on semi loads and they put these pallets down that have about 4 hives on them, and they have them in the almond orchards. And what's really strange is they're there to pollinate. All those bees have been transported because they are going to work those hives. Well, what's sad is they have to feed the bees to do that because there's no nectar there in those almonds. Most of the time, it's very rare that there would be any nectar. So they're just there to pollinate and move the pollen around and take it back to the hive. So they have to feed them when they're doing that. Um, there's no other insect that we can work like that and that will do that kind of a job for us because you need so many of them. And that's why they're like, well, migratory beekeepers. The bees are migratory. They're going up crisscrossing all across the country pollinating services. And if we don't have our honeybees for the food supply, especially a lot of the foods that we enjoy eating, um, hmm, but there are people actually working on robots, little robots to do this work because they think down the road we're not going to have our honeybees. Imagine that world.
Well, folks, I guess it's true. You learn something new every day. And that is precisely why we bring you these webinars and knowledgeable experts like Sheila who've done it and can share their experiences. Sheila, thank you so much. We're going to see you real soon during questions and answers.